In March 2021, the container ship Ever Given ran aground in the Suez Canal and blocked global shipping for 6 days. $10 billion. Per Dalton Y. in Disrupted Trade. Every newspaper on Earth, it introduced most people to the concept of a supply chain. But the container's greatest disruption happened 65 years earlier, in Newark, New Jersey, when 58 boxes on a converted tanker quietly ended the world that came before. The Ever Given failure was visible. The 1956 invention was invisible. Both were produced by the same metal box that made your iPhone, your sneakers, and your grocery store's abundance economically possible. Malcolm McLean was 42 years old when he loaded 58 aluminum containers onto the converted tanker SS Ideal X in Newark, New Jersey, on April 26, 1956. He was a North Carolina trucker, not a shipping executive, not an engineer, not an economist. His specific insight, the cost of shipping was not the voyage across the ocean, it was the loading and unloading. Stevedores manually loading breakbulk cargo onto ships cost approximately $5.83 per ton. McLean's containers cost approximately 16 cents per ton to load, 97% cheaper. His second insight, the one that made the revolution global rather than local, was standardization. If every container was the same size, every crane, ship, truck, and railway car could be redesigned to handle them interchangeably. The ISO standard container, formalized by the International Organization for Standardization in 1961, is the specific technical decision that made the container revolution global rather than merely American. The standard 20-foot equivalent unit, 20 feet long, 8 feet wide, 8.5 feet tall. A 40-foot container is 2 TEOs. Every container port in the world is designed around this dimension. Every container ship's cell guides are built to this dimension. Every crane spreader bar is set to this dimension. Every railway, flat car, and truck chassis is designed for this dimension. The specific genius of ISO standardization. A container manufactured in China, shipped to Rotterdam, transferred to a truck in Germany, and stored in a warehouse in Munich never needs to be opened, repackaged, or manually handled between the factory floor and the retail store. McLean's specific contribution to the container standardization was commercially counterintuitive and historically unusual. He patented the container corner casting design, the specific metal fitting that allows containers to be locked to ships, stacked on each other, and lifted by cranes, and then donated the patent to the maritime industry for free. His reasoning: if the container required royalty payments, competing shipping lines would develop their own incompatible designs. Without universal adoption of his standard, the network effect that made the container valuable would not materialize. McLean gave away the patent that would have made him enormously wealthy because he understood that a universal standard was worth more than a proprietary one. The container revolution required McLean to act against his immediate financial interest to create a larger economic opportunity. The container's specific economic mechanism is the most important and least understood aspect of the globalization story. Before the container, the cost of shipping goods internationally was a significant fraction of their value, making it economically rational to manufacture goods close to their consumers. After the container's 97% cost reduction, the cost of shipping goods internationally became so small relative to labor cost differences that it became economically rational to manufacture wherever labor was cheapest and ship the finished product anywhere. A television manufactured in South Korea cost less to ship to New York than the labor cost difference between American and Korean manufacturing. The container did not create wage arbitrage. It made wage arbitrage economically dominant over geographic proximity for the first time in history. The academic evidence for the container's economic impact is documented and specific. Economist Mark Levinson, whose 2006 book The Box is the Definitive History, estimated that the container increased bilateral trade between countries by approximately 320% over the 20 years following containerization. A separate study in the American Economic Review found that the container increased trade by more than all trade liberalization agreements of the 1960s and 1970s combined. The specific mechanism was not just cost reduction, but predictability. Containers arrived on schedule, with known contents, undamaged. Just-in-time manufacturing, the Toyota production system, and its descendants, depend specifically on the container's predictability. Without reliable delivery windows, just-in-time is impossible. The container made lean manufacturing viable at global scale. The container's specific human cost in the Western world is the deindustrialization of manufacturing communities that had been the economic backbone of the American Midwest, the British North, and the industrial heartlands of Western Europe. Gary, Indiana; Youngstown, Ohio; Detroit, Michigan; Sheffield, England; the Ruhr Valley, Germany. These communities did not lose their factories because of trade agreements, currency manipulation, or government policy alone. They lost them because the container made it economically rational to manufacture in lower-wage countries and ship the finished product to Western consumers for less than the cost of producing it locally. The container is the specific infrastructure of deindustrialization, the mechanism by which manufacturing left and did not return. The stevedores, the men who manually loaded and unloaded ships before the container, are the most direct human casualties of the container revolution. In the port of New York alone, approximately 50 longshoremen worked the docks in the 1950s. By the 1980s, the number had fallen to approximately 10, handling a volume of cargo that had increased enormously. The specific mathematics, containerization increased cargo throughput by approximately 10 times while reducing the workforce by approximately 80%. The International Longshoremen's Association fought the container's adoption through strikes, work rules, and political lobbying, understanding clearly that the box was eliminating their profession. They delayed, but could not stop the transition. The container's efficiency was too large an economic advantage to be contained by labor negotiation. China's transformation into the world's factory is the container revolution's most consequential geopolitical consequence. In 19,980, China's share of global manufacturing exports was negligible. By 2020, China accounted for approximately 28% of global manufacturing output, the largest share any single country has held since American manufacturing dominance in the mid-20th century. The specific mechanism, China's combination of low wages, disciplined manufacturing labor, and government industrial policy, was only able to access global markets because the container made the shipping cost between Chinese factories and American consumers economically trivial. Without the container, China's geographic distance from its primary export markets would have been a prohibitive cost. With the container, distance became irrelevant. Chinese manufacturing became the global default. The container's specific role in China's rise is documented in the economic geography of Chinese port development. China's coastal cities, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Shanghai, Ningbo, Tianjin, developed their extraordinary manufacturing economies, specifically in proximity to container ports. The Pearl River Delta's manufacturing concentration, built around the port of Guangzhou and port of Shenzhen. Shenzhen itself, a fishing village of approximately 30 people in 1979, when China established it as a special economic zone, had a population of approximately 17 million by 2020 and was home to some of the world's most sophisticated electronics manufacturing. The container made Shenzhen's transformation from fishing village to global manufacturing hub economically possible within 40 years. The box built the city. COVID-19's disruption of global supply chains in 2020 and 2021 was the container economy's most public stress test, and the specific moment when the general public discovered what economists had known for decades. The global supply chain is extraordinarily efficient in normal conditions and extraordinarily fragile under disruption. The specific failure mechanisms, container ships arriving in Los Angeles, were unable to unload because port workers were ill or restricted. Containers accumulated at ports while factories waited for components. The semiconductor shortage, a specific supply chain failure cascading from one input component, shut down automobile factories in Michigan, Ohio, and Germany. The toilet paper shortage, the infant formula crisis, the microchip shortage. COVID revealed the container economy's specific vulnerability. The efficiency of a zero-inventory system is inseparable from its fragility. The post-COVID supply chain restructuring, reshoring, nearshoring, friend-shoring, is the most significant rethinking of the container economy's logic since the container's invention. Governments and corporations that had optimized for efficiency are now investing in resilience, building inventory buffers, diversifying supplier geography, and bringing selected manufacturing closer to consumers. The semiconductor industry's specific example, America's CHIPS Act, Europe's CHIPS Act, and Japan's semiconductor manufacturing investments, each representing government-funded attempts to rebuild domestic semiconductor production that the container economy made economically irrational to maintain. The supply chain restructuring is not undoing the container revolution. It is adjusting the container economy's specific geographic distribution in response to the resilience lessons of COVID and the security concerns of US-China strategic competition. The container has created a new economic geography of the world, one organized around port cities rather than inland industrial centers. The world's 10 busiest container ports in 2025 are all in Asia, 7 in China, 1 in Singapore, 1 in South Korea, 1 in Malaysia. The specific geographic consequence: the container has shifted global economic gravity toward Asia's coastal cities and away from the inland industrial cities that dominated the pre-container economy. Chicago, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Birmingham were great industrial cities because they sat on coal, iron ore, and rail networks. Shanghai, Shenzhen, Busan, and Singapore are great economic cities because they sit on container port infrastructure. The container rewrote the geographic logic of economic advantage more completely than any previous transportation revolution. The ordinary consumer's relationship to the container is invisible but pervasive, and became briefly visible during COVID's supply chain disruptions. The specific calculation: the average American home contains approximately 200,000 objects. The majority were manufactured in Asia and arrived in the United States by container ship. The clothing, the electronics, the furniture, the appliances, the toys. The specific material abundance of contemporary Western life is entirely dependent on the container's economics. Before the container, this material abundance was available only to the wealthy. After the container's cost reduction, it became accessible to the middle class because global manufacturing made it affordable. The container is the specific mechanism of contemporary material abundance, and the specific mechanism of the wage stagnation that produced it simultaneously. The container's specific contribution to the Economic Turning Point series is the demonstration that the most consequential economic revolutions are often the most technically mundane: a metal box, a standardized dimension, a donated patent, a 97% cost reduction, no breakthrough science, no government program, no Nobel Prize. Malcolm McLean is not in most history books. His container is in almost every home on Earth. The container episode establishes the series' second analytical lesson. Complementing the Bretton Woods episodes, great designs contain their own flaws. The most consequential economic turning points are often made by people solving specific operational problems, not by economists. Designing systems. McLean was solving a trucking problem. He accidentally designed the infrastructure of globalization. 58 containers on a converted tanker, 16 cents per ton, a donated patent, 97% cheaper. Gary, Indiana, Shenzhen, China. 17 million people where 30,000 lived. The Ever Given across the Suez Canal. The CHIPS Act rebuilding what the container made irrational to keep. The supply chains you discovered during COVID were built by a trucking entrepreneur from North Carolina who never finished college. The Economic Turning Point series continues next episode with the Green Revolution, the agricultural program that fed 1 billion people and simultaneously created a global dependency on seed varieties, fertilizers, and irrigation systems controlled by a handful of corporations and governments. Norman Borlaug won the Nobel Peace Prize for it. The revolution he led is still feeding the world in 2026. The dependencies it created are still producing the food security crises you read about in the news. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the story doesn't end here, it evolves. The container is still loading. The ships are still sailing. The global supply chain is still running, more carefully than it was before COVID, more regionally than it was before the US-China competition, but still fundamentally the architecture that Malcolm McLean built with 58 boxes in Newark in 1956.